you can listen to a squalling brat and find it musical. That this child, I'll never forget waking up one morning and listening to a child whining. The child wasn't saying anything, there were no words in it, it was just a plaint. And it wasn't exactly crying, it was a kind of and there was something marvelous about it. This child's wonderfully articulate protest against some sort of nuisance. And so, listening into those things without interpreting them, listening to one's own interior frustration and pain in the same way without interpreting it as being on one side or the other, on the good side or the bad side, on the black side or the white side, is what makes it possible, you see, to transmute these things. But you can't do this. You can't really, honestly transmute pain into a form of play, a form of weird, far-out sensations that are basically just that. So long as you fail to see the inner unity of the opposites, so long as you fall for the idea that you are nothing more than this particular life, than this particular ego, which came from nowhere and is going nowhere. While you remain under that illusion, you see, you first of all, you don't see your identity with everything else that exists. Now, if death then is a joke, I remember the biggest joke on death I ever saw. I mentioned this in my book. We visited the Capuchin friars' crypt in the Via Veneto in Rome. Some of you may have seen it, where there are 3 underground chapels where everything is made of bones. And the altar is made of bones. The pedestals of the altar are all shin bones. And then there are piles of skulls, and the decoration of flowers on the ceiling are ribs alternating with vertebrae. And the vertebrae are the flowers, and the ribs curl this way, curl this way, curl this way, the twining stems. And the whole thing is bones, and they have even a few full intact skeletons dressed in monks' robes standing on either side of these altars. It's the craziest thing you ever saw. And then when you have seen it and you come out, there is a little friar with a beard taking your offering at the top of the steps. And he had a funny, wicked gleam in his eye. And one could see that this was a joke. The whole thing was a joke. It was constructed by people who had somehow overcome the fear of death. Couldn't possibly have such a thing as that. And so I was fascinated by it, because I thought that on the day of the resurrection there's going to be a tremendous scuffle fitting all those bones together and everybody getting up the stairs for the last judgment. Well, so if it is seen that death is the jest, but the question is, you see, we are so tormented by the bugbear of it being the real end, by the imagination of the possibility of being in the dark forever. Now, you really must think this through, because it is a pure delusion. If you think, first of all, seriously about annihilation of consciousness, you will realize that annihilation of consciousness couldn't possibly be an experience. But being in the dark forever could be an experience. I mean, supposing you were buried alive and somehow you were immortal, but you had to stay shut up in a tomb for always and always and always. That would be pretty grim. But the annihilation of consciousness is not an experience at all. There isn't anything there to be afraid of. So if that's what's going to happen, there's nothing to worry about, I assure you. But on the other hand, if you think about it longer, about a state of eternal just not being at all, you know, you realize that nature abhors a vacuum. And that since, just as the universe happened once, it can happen again. Since you were born once, you know, it did happen, really. Well, it can happen again. Only the next you won't remember the one now, just as the one now doesn't remember the one before. Not because you've forgotten, but because memory is transmitted along certain channels. It requires the vehicle of brains, for example. It requires books and other records to maintain it. But as I pointed out yesterday, the fundamental what have you that underlies all this doesn't need a memory. It doesn't need to store memories. And so, just in the same way as you don't need to be conscious of the inner formations of your brain. Also, I mean, here I'm talking speculatively. Also, there are curious connections where we don't see any. That is to say, the interval between events is not insignificant. Just as you don't hear melody unless you hear the interval between tones. It's the interval that counts. So in the same way, blank intervals between successive manifestations of the universe, and blank intervals between your forgetting who you are altogether and dying, and someone suddenly becoming a baby. The blank intervals are not insignificant. Every painter knows, every architect knows, that the space around an object or inside an object is just as important as the object. That again is the fact. If you don't notice the importance of intervals and you don't notice the importance of space, it is as if you had settled on the carpet here for the black design being the thing and the white background as having no significance. So what about the inside of this room? What about the shape of space that it encloses? We would say this is nothing more than a certain quantity of air. But don't you see that the distance, the space between that wall and this window is life room? That is not nothing. That it's just as important. It comes into being at the same moment as the walls come into being. It connects them. And so likewise the space between our planet and other planets is not insignificant. So once you see that intervals of apparent nothingness are significant intervals, that their size makes all the difference to what's happening. When the intervals between dits are short, the note is high. When the intervals between the dits are long, the note is low or large, the high being little. See, why do we say high and low as distinct from little and big? Big instruments make big noises, little instruments make tiny noises. But at any rate, it's the interval that's important. So then, once you see the importance of the interval, you have seen that the white is as important as the black, or the other way round if you want to change your analogy. Do you see how you can switch these analogies? In one case, the white can be the nothing, the unimportant, whereas the black is the mark somebody made with a crayon. Or the other way round, the black can be the darkness, and the white is the flash of lightning that appears in the darkness. Change your analogy. It's like saying, once we used to say about high matters, high matters, lofty thoughts. But now we don't. It's more fashionable to say deep matters and profound thoughts. Someone was telling me yesterday in the group here that they were going to an Indian village in New Mexico where they had Christianity. But when the speaker referred to Jesus and God and so on, he pointed down all the time. Because, you see, he felt that things grew up like this from below. Whereas, of course, the ancient cults out of which the Jewish and Christian religions grew had the idea that the life of the sun and the rain came down from the heavens and fertilized the feminine earth, which then responded. But these things keep changing because you can keep switching your point of view. You can see the black as the design against the white background, the white as the design against the black background, and you can flip back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And the more you do that, the more you realize that the pairs go together. Anxiety is the state of trying not to flip. All life is flipping. It's called, its flip-floppability is the condition of life, this way and that way. When you're trying to resist flip-floppability, you're anxious. You see? When you push against it, it throbs in a way that you interpret as fear. And all rigid personalities, people who can't swing, who have no movement in their hips, as it were, psychologically, they are resisting flip-floppability. But when you understand flip-floppability, and that this is the way things are, then you laugh, because that is the big flip-flop.